This is how a small-town disappearance turned into a years-long cold case, and why justice came far too late. For 5 years, the truth about what happened to Katie Sepich existed. It wasn't hidden in a locked file. It wasn't lost in failed forensics. It was carried silently by people who knew more than they ever said. This isn't just the story of a girl who disappeared. It's the story of what silence can do and how long it can delay justice. Before we begin, if you're a fan of strange, dark, true crime mysteries delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Consider subscribe. This is Nocture, the storyteller, and this is a story that stayed buried far too long. The town of Lowell was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Streets lined with modest houses, neatly trimmed lawns, the occasional dog barking in the distance. Life moved slowly here, predictably, quietly. Katie Sepich fit perfectly into that rhythm. A high school student with a smile that could light a room, she carried the energy of youth with a subtle, natural charm that drew her to her. Yet in a place like this, normality could feel almost fragile, like a thin layer of glass covering the lives of everyone who lived there. On that day, there was nothing to hint at what was coming. Katie woke as she did every morning, packed her backpack with textbooks and pens, said goodbye to her family, and walked the familiar streets toward school. She passed neighbors tending gardens, cars parked along curbs, and the usual flurry of activity from morning routines. Everything was ordinary, routine, predictable. Nothing about her steps betrayed the storm that would follow. At school, she laughed with friends in the cafeteria, exchanged casual remarks with teachers, moved between classes as though the day had been scripted for her. To anyone watching, it was the portrait of a normal day in a small town. But as ordinary as her day seemed, there was a subtle tension in the air, the kind of unease that doesn't announce itself, but settles quietly into the spaces between conversations, between glances, in the pause of a hallway where laughter lingers a second too long. It was imperceptible, yet it would become the first echo of something far more troubling. After school, Katie followed her usual path home. She waved to familiar faces, greeted friends walking the same route, her steps deliberate, confident, unaware of the invisible line she was about to cross. The street seemed to almost hold their breath. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the gentle wind, the sun cast long shadows over the sidewalks. Ordinary, tranquil, deceiving. That normalcy is what makes disappearances so sharp, so shocking. There was no dramatic confrontation, no sudden danger visible to the naked eye, just a young life moving through a world that for a fleeting moment felt safe. Her family would later recall every detail from that afternoon, the hum of the air conditioner in the living room, the aroma of dinner being prepared, the exact sound of the front door closing behind her. Those memories, ordinary and mundane at the time, would be etched into their minds as the last moments they shared with her. In the quiet recollections of her friends, the small jokes, the shared smiles, the unremarkable chatter of a school day all became fragments of a timeline that would be scrutinized for years. Ordinary details became extraordinary because they were all that remained. By the evening, when Katie didn't arrive home as expected, the first stirrings of concern began. A text unanswered, a knock on a friend's door with no answer, a mother's worry that would not be soothed. And yet, even in that uncertainty, there was a hope, a quiet denial. Maybe she was just late, caught up with friends, distracted by something minor. Small towns are built on trust, and trust can be stubborn. But the absence was tangible, a silence that grew heavier with each passing hour. What is so haunting about a disappearance like Katie's is how quickly the ordinary fractures. One moment, life is familiar. The next, it is filled with questions that cannot yet be answered. Every familiar path she walked now carried the weight of what was lost. Every empty room, every unanswered call, every glance at the door that remained closed became a silent witness to a disruption that no one could yet name. This chapter of her life and the town's life was about normalcy, the rhythm of everyday existence, the texture of a small town where nothing ever seemed out of place. And in that normalcy lies the tragedy. It made the absence all the more stark. There was no sign, no warning, no immediate clue to indicate that a disappearance was unfolding. Only a growing tension, a subtle shift in the pattern of daily life, a sense that something essential had been removed from the world without leaving a trace. In the quiet aftermath, as the first shadows of worry crept over her family, neighbors, and friends, the town remained outwardly unchanged. Children still played in yards, cars still moved along the streets, the sun continued its path across the sky. But beneath the surface, the fabric of the community had been pierced. A delicate line between safety and fear stretched taut, ready to snap. Katie's disappearance was not just the loss of a young life, it was the introduction of a profound uncertainty into a place that had once felt entirely safe. And so, the last ordinary day of Katie Sepich was over. It ended not with fanfare, but with a quiet absence that would resonate for years. A day that began with laughter, warmth, and routine, ended with silence, questions, and the first echoes of a mystery that would haunt a community long after the sun had set on that ordinary town.
By the time night fell, the ordinary rhythms of Katie Sepich's day had begun to fray. What started as subtle unease soon grew into a quiet alarm. When she failed to return home at the expected hour, her absence was first met with disbelief, then with a gnawing worry that settled over her family like a shadow. Her parents called friends, retraced familiar paths, and checked the places she might have gone. Each unanswered call, each empty corner of the town she had known so well, deepened the growing void. The streets that had once seemed safe and familiar now carried the weight of uncertainty. Every darkened alleyway, every unlit porch, whispered questions that had no answers yet. Word spread slowly at first, then like wildfire. Neighbors who had waved at her from across lawns, shopkeepers who had seen her smile in passing, began to notice the absence. Conversations were hushed, laced with disbelief and the unspoken fear that something irreversible had occurred. The community, once confident in its small-town predictability, began to feel the cracks of unease. In those early hours, the distinction between a temporary worry and a looming tragedy was not yet clear. Some whispered about the possibility of a runaway, a teenage rebellion misread by those who loved her. Others felt the sharper edge of instinct, the kind that speaks in the dark, suggesting something far graver. The truth was invisible, hidden beneath the layers of assumptions and the slow-moving machinery of a small-town investigation. The police arrived, methodical and constrained. Their presence brought structure but not comfort. Searches were organized along predictable lines, familiar routes, known hangouts, places a teenager might wander. Canvases of neighbors were questioned, each response a mixture of certainty and uncertainty. Yet for every clue uncovered, there seemed to be two more questions left unanswered. Each passing hour without news stretched the night longer, the silence heavier. For Katie's family, the world contracted into moments of waiting. Each sound, the squeal of tires, the bark of a dog, the ring of the phone, was charged with hope and dread. Even the familiar became alien. Every shadow could conceal a truth. Every echo could carry the answer that would not come. Their lives, once measured in routines and small joys, were now punctuated by absence, by the gnawing tension of not knowing. Meanwhile, the town itself began to wrestle with the unknown. How could someone disappear without a trace? How could life carry on when one of its own was suspended in uncertainty? Parents held children closer. Friends watched one another with tentative suspicion. The fabric of daily life remained intact, but beneath it, threads of anxiety began to tangle. Conversations that once flowed freely now hesitated at the edges, careful not to touch the questions that had no answers. As night deepened, a pall settled over both family and town alike. Each person carried fragments of suspicion and fear, none complete, none verifiable. The absence of Katie Sepich became a presence in itself, a weight that pressed on every thought, every interaction, every corner of the community. What had seemed improbable now felt painfully possible. The ordinary day had ended, a disappearance had begun, and with it a story that would stretch across years, tangled in silence, shadows, and the slow unraveling of a small town's certainty.
As the initial searches ended, the reality settled in. Katie Sepich had vanished, and the answers that everyone hoped for never came. The police followed the leads they had. Witness statements were collected, locations were retraced, and small pieces of information were examined over and over. But there were no breakthroughs, no solid evidence, no clear trail. The questions multiplied. How could someone disappear in a town so small, so familiar? How could the familiar streets, the neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone, yield nothing? Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Each passing day deepened the uncertainty, leaving Katie's family suspended in a limbo that no one else could see. A limbo defined by waiting, hoping, and slowly losing faith. The community tried to move on. Life resumed its normal rhythm. Schools opened, families celebrated holidays, and the quiet hum of small-town life continued. But for Katie's parents, for her siblings, the absence was constant, unrelenting. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every news report could bring another reminder that answers were nowhere in sight. Detectives spoke carefully. They described the case as challenging, unusual, cold, but those words offered little comfort. Challenging didn't explain the empty evenings, the unanswered questions, the birthdays celebrated without her presence. Unusual didn't soften the silence that stretched across years. In a small town, every unanswered question grows heavier, and some questions, the ones about a missing girl, never truly leave. They echo in the hearts of those left behind, a constant reminder that justice had yet to arrive, and that time, no matter how patient, could not fill the space she left behind. In small towns, the absence of answers is rarely complete silence. Instead, it is filled with whispers, quiet conversations behind closed doors, and half-formed suspicions that never fully surface. People remembered small details, a glance, a strange remark, an unexplained movement, but few spoke them aloud. Fear, loyalty, and the unspoken rules of community held them back. To speak too loudly could bring shame, suspicion, or confrontation. To speak too softly risked nothing changing at all. Some remembered hearing things, others remembered seeing things, but when the time came to share, those memories were often muffled, diminished, or dismissed. Over time, these fragments of truth became shadows, lingering at the edges of the investigation, but never taking shape. Investigators noted the patterns. There were inconsistencies, small contradictions in statements, and pieces that didn't fit. Yet without confirmation, without proof, nothing could be acted upon. Each lead that could have moved the case forward remained just out of reach, suspended in the weight of unspoken words. For Katie's family, this was an invisible burden. They sensed it, even when others refused to acknowledge it. They felt the distance between what was known and what could be revealed. And in that distance lived frustration, fear, and a gnawing realization. Sometimes silence protects not the innocent, but the guilty. The town itself became a paradox, familiar and comforting to some, but a place of quiet secrets to others. And in that quiet, the truth waited, patient, obscured, and unwilling to reveal itself until the moment was unavoidable. Years passed. The days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. For most of the town, life carried on, but for Katie Sepich's family, time became a cruel companion, each tick of the clock a reminder that she was still missing. Birthdays came and went. Holidays were celebrated without laughter fully reaching its usual warmth. Vacations were taken, yet the empty space she had once filled remained.
Friends and neighbors gradually adjusted, forgetting small details, moving on from the story they once followed in the newspapers, but the family could not. Investigators checked in occasionally, notes were reviewed, files reorganized, but nothing concrete emerged. The case was labeled cold, a term meant to categorize the investigation, but for those living it, there was nothing cold about the anguish, nothing clinical about the waiting. With each passing year, the weight of absence grew heavier. Photographs became relics of a life interrupted. Memories once shared freely were now tinged with sorrow, carefully preserved to avoid the constant sting of loss. Time moves forward indiscriminately, indifferent to grief. And yet, in this relentless flow, some questions, the most important ones, remain unanswered. Who knew what? Who could have spoken up? And above all, where was Katie? The silence that had once been empty now carried gravity, a quiet accusation against the passage of years and the absence of truth. For the family, every day without answers was a day justice had yet to arrive. After years of silence, cold nights, and unanswered questions, something shifted. A break, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. In a case that had long seemed suspended in time, this was the moment when the dormant gears of investigation began to turn again. For 5 years, the search for Katie Sepich had yielded little beyond the echoes of what might have been. Files had been meticulously organized, leads rechecked, and evidence re-examined, but nothing concrete had emerged. The case remained unresolved, a wound that refused to heal, a question mark that hovered over the lives of those who had been closest to her. Then, unexpectedly, new information surfaced. It came not from a dramatic confession or a chance discovery at a crime scene, but from a quieter source, someone who had remained on the periphery, observing, holding knowledge that had never been shared. Perhaps it was fear, loyalty, or doubt that had kept them silent. Perhaps they had assumed the truth would surface eventually, or that someone else would speak first. Whatever the reason, the moment they stepped forward changed everything. Detectives approached the information with caution. After years of frustration, there was a skepticism that tempered hope. They had been here before, leads that promised more than they delivered, witnesses who remembered details too late, evidence that dissolved under scrutiny. But this time, there was something different. There was a consistency, a clarity, a path that had not been available in the early days of the investigation. The first step was verification. Investigators returned to old files, reviewed witness statements, cross-referenced timelines, and examined physical evidence anew. Every angle was reconsidered. The patience and meticulousness that defined the original investigation became essential once more. In cold cases, breakthroughs rarely come suddenly or dramatically. They come through persistence, careful analysis, and the slow piecing together of fragments that have waited, often silently, for the right context. And slowly, the case began to take shape again. Details that previously seemed inconsequential now assumed significance. Minor inconsistencies in prior testimonies, notes from the early searches, overlooked footprints, or fleeting memories, each became a piece in a puzzle that had long been incomplete. The breakthrough was not cinematic. There were no flashing lights, no immediate arrests, no sweeping revelations. It was quiet, methodical, and precise, the work of investigators committed to uncovering the truth against the weight of time. As the investigation reopened, the emotional landscape shifted. For Katie's family, the new developments brought a mixture of hope and anxiety. Years of unresolved grief and constant questioning had left their mark. Each day without answers had etched lines into faces, deepened the hollowness in hearts, and cultivated a caution around hope itself. Yet now there was a reason to believe that the silence might finally end. Investigators had to tread carefully. After so much time, memories had faded, witnesses had moved on, and evidence had deteriorated. Missteps could erase the delicate trail that was emerging. Every interview was conducted with precision, every statement cross-checked against the tapestry of prior information. The tension was palpable but restrained. The investigators' discipline mirrored the careful restraint demanded by justice itself. In small towns, news travels quickly. Rumors of the reopening spread quietly at first, conversations flickering like candlelight in the dark. "Have you heard? They might finally know something." But even as whispers began to circulate, the details remained tightly controlled. Authorities understood that the difference between clarity and chaos often rested in the handling of information. Too much speculation could compromise the investigation, while too little could fuel mistrust and fear. The emotional weight on the investigators was undeniable. They were acutely aware that 5 years ago something had gone wrong, not necessarily in their competence, but in the circumstances, the lack of cooperation, the missing evidence, the pieces that had remained silent until now. Each step forward was measured against this history, a constant reminder of how easily time can erode certainty. And yet, there was a shift in atmosphere. What had once been stagnation now carried momentum. Witnesses who had been hesitant began to recall forgotten details. Officers revisiting prior crime scenes noticed subtleties that had escaped them before. Forensic analysts were able to apply modern techniques to older evidence, revealing patterns invisible to prior investigations. The case was no longer frozen in the past. It was moving, deliberately but inevitably, towards clarity. The psychological toll on the family remained intense. Years of silence and uncertainty had left them wary. Each new development, while promising, was a reminder of the time that had already passed. Their grief was layered now, a combination of loss, frustration, and the fragile hope that perhaps, finally, the truth would emerge. Investigators spoke cautiously about the progress. They could not promise closure, but they could outline the renewed avenues of inquiry, the witnesses who had finally come forward, the evidence that had gained new relevance. In every statement there was care, words chosen to maintain the integrity of the investigation, to prevent false hope or speculation from clouding the facts. The break was not a sudden revelation, it was a careful unfolding. Each piece of information, each observation, each re-examination contributed to a new understanding of the case. Slowly, the narrative that had long been incomplete began to emerge, a timeline refined, a story reconstructed, a truth gradually lifting from the shadows. And yet, the darkness remained. The case had taken its toll on everyone involved. The investigators, the family, the community. The shadows of those lost years lingered, a reminder that truth, when delayed, carries with it the weight of human choices and omissions. The break was not a restoration of time. It was a moment when time's consequences could finally be addressed. It was in this moment that the story pivoted. What seemed impossible for half a decade, clarity, direction, a path forward, was suddenly within reach. The case that had been stalled by silence, fear, and circumstance was awakening, moving cautiously but inevitably towards resolution. In the dim light of renewed investigation, Katie Sapich's absence was finally met with action. The break did not erase the past. It did not bring back the years of waiting or the unspoken questions that haunted everyone involved. But it marked a turning point, the first step towards uncovering the truth that had remained just out of reach, and the first moment when hope, long deferred, could begin to take form. For investigators, it was a reminder of why persistence matters. For the family, it was a fragile promise that the silence of the past might finally be answered. And for the community, it was a moment of reckoning, a quiet, undeniable lesson in the cost of inaction, the weight of secrecy, and the enduring demand of justice, no matter how long it waits. In the world of cold cases, breakthroughs are rarely dramatic. They are slow, careful, and deliberate. But when they arrive, they carry the power to illuminate shadows that have persisted for years, to give voice to truths long muted, and to set in motion the long overdue pursuit of justice. The break had come, and with it, the story began to move forward again.
Once the break came, the quiet patience of the investigation shifted. What had been dormant for years now moved with deliberate momentum. The case that had been stalled by uncertainty, fear, and omission was being rebuilt piece by piece. Every statement, every scrap of evidence, every memory that had lingered unspoken was re-examined in search of a coherent narrative, a truth that had remained buried in fragments.
Reconstructing the truth in a cold case is a meticulous endeavor. It is not a matter of intuition or dramatics. It is the painstaking work of aligning timelines, verifying recollections, and discerning patterns from chaos. Investigators began by reviewing the earliest days of the disappearance, scrutinizing the sequence of events that had, at the time, seemed straightforward, but had left gaps large enough to obscure crucial details. Each lead was reassessed. Witnesses who had previously offered partial or vague recollections were interviewed again, this time with more context and the weight of hindsight. Often, what had once seemed inconsequential, a glance, a passing remark, a minor contradiction, now gained significance. Patterns began to emerge, connecting disparate pieces of the puzzle that had previously floated in isolation. Technology also played a role. Advances in forensic analysis allowed investigators to examine evidence that had been set aside or deemed unhelpful in the early stages. Items collected from the original search were tested anew. Digital records, once overlooked, provided timelines and connections that had been invisible 5 years earlier. Slowly, the outlines of a narrative began to form, fragile yet undeniable. The process was emotionally charged. For the family, hearing investigators describe what had been learned, what was being reconstructed, was both relieving and painful. Relief came from the acknowledgement that the work was progressing. Pain came from realizing that for years this clarity had been absent. Each revelation reminded them of time lost, of answers delayed, and of the moments that could never be reclaimed. Investigators worked methodically to build a timeline that reflected both confirmed facts and reasonable inference, carefully distinguishing between the two. Early assumptions, guesses made in the confusion of the initial disappearance, were corrected. The truth, they realized, had never changed, only their understanding of it had evolved. Facts that had once been misinterpreted or overlooked now aligned, revealing a coherent sequence of events. This reconstruction required revisiting the places and people tied to Katie's final known movements. Investigators retraced paths, revisited interviews, and cross-referenced statements with physical evidence. Small details, such as the time someone reported seeing her, the location of her personal belongings, or the state of a door or window, were scrutinized for consistency. Each point became a thread, which, when woven together, began to form the tapestry of what had occurred. One of the most challenging aspects was disentangling rumor from reality. Over 5 years, the community had generated its own narratives, whispers, assumptions, and conjectures that had, in many cases, obscured the facts. Investigators had to sift carefully, separating reliable information from speculation, understanding that even small missteps could compromise the reconstruction. Patience and precision were paramount. As the narrative took shape, investigators noted the impact of earlier silence. Had certain witnesses spoken sooner? Had minor details been shared promptly? The case might have progressed more quickly, perhaps preventing some of the anguish endured by the family. Each unspoken word and withheld observation became a stark reminder of the human dimension of justice, that the truth is not always obstructed by lack of evidence, but by hesitation, fear, or loyalty. The reconstructed timeline revealed previously noticed connections. Locations, interactions, and movements aligned in ways that clarified moments once dismissed as irrelevant. Investigators could now map a coherent chain of events, identifying the gaps that had long frustrated earlier efforts. The slow, careful accumulation of facts turned uncertainty into clarity, suspicion into understanding, and conjecture into reasoned conclusion. Reconstructing the truth also highlighted the contrast between perception and reality. Early reports, formed under the pressure of uncertainty, had misrepresented key aspects of the disappearance. These misperceptions were not errors born of negligence, they were natural outcomes of a case complicated by silence, fear, and incomplete information. Revisiting these assumptions was not merely a technical exercise, it was a process of correcting the record, restoring fidelity to a story that had been distorted by time and circumstance. For the family, the emerging picture was harrowing and clarifying. They could finally comprehend the sequence of events that had led to Katie's absence, understand the decisions and missteps that had delayed answers, and begin to process the emotional toll with a framework grounded in fact. Knowledge did not erase grief, but it gave it context, a way to anchor the sorrow in reality rather than speculation. Investigators also reflected on the role of community in the reconstruction. Silence, loyalty, and fear slowed the case, but now cooperation became essential. Witnesses who had once hesitated were encouraged to provide details they had held back. The subtle power of collective responsibility became evident. The truth could only emerge when people chose to speak, to share what they knew, and to trust the process of inquiry. The atmosphere around the investigation grew tense but focused. Each interview, each piece of corroboration, each revisited site added weight to the emerging narrative. What had once been a fog of uncertainty now began to resolve into sharp lines of understanding. The reconstruction was not just procedural, it was psychological, requiring careful attention to human memory, perception, and emotion. As the investigators pieced together the events surrounding Katie's disappearance, a pattern of cause and effect became evident. Decisions, interactions, and movements aligned in ways that illuminated the reality of the case. The timeline was more than a record of facts, it was a story of human behavior, of choices made under pressure, and of the consequences that ripple outward when information remains hidden. The slow unveiling of truth also illuminated the limitations imposed by time. Evidence that had deteriorated, memories that had faded, and opportunities that had been lost were reminders that justice delayed carries its own cost. Yet even in this sobering context, the reconstruction provided a path forward, a means of understanding, accountability, and eventual resolution. By the end of the reconstruction phase, the investigators possessed a clear framework, a timeline that reconciled discrepancies, a set of verified facts, and a coherent understanding of the sequence of events. The story that once seemed opaque now emerged with clarity, not in dramatic revelation, but in careful accumulation. Each piece of the puzzle, once isolated and obscure, now fit into a narrative that honored both the facts and the memory of the person at its center. This was the moment where the investigation moved from pursuit to precision. The fog of uncertainty was lifting, replaced by a careful, deliberate mapping of reality. The truth that had remained fragmented for years was no longer inaccessible. It could be articulated, scrutinized, and acted upon. And though it could not undo the passage of time, it provided the foundation for accountability and closure. In reconstructing the truth, the case finally began to achieve what had long seemed impossible, a path from confusion to clarity, from silence to understanding. The painstaking work of investigators, combined with the courage of those who came forward after years of hesitation, transformed a story that had been defined by absence into one guided by evidence, reason, and careful human insight. The reconstruction did not erase grief. It did not replace the years lost or the unanswered questions of the past, but it did something nearly as vital. It gave form to the truth. And in doing so, it set the stage for the next step, accountability, where justice, long deferred, would finally begin to catch up with the facts that had waited silently for so long. In the quiet intensity of the investigation, the fragments of the past had finally aligned. The truth, once obscured, was no longer invisible, and for the first time since Katie Savage disappeared, it felt possible that the long journey toward resolution could reach its end.
With the truth reconstructed, the investigation moved from understanding to action. What had been fragmented and unclear for years now demanded a response, a reckoning with the reality that had been quietly obscured by time, silence, and fear. Arrests were made. Names that had once been whispered in hushed speculation were now formally connected to the case. The law had finally intervened, not in the chaos of confusion, but with deliberate, procedural clarity. Charges were announced, court dates scheduled, and the machinery of justice began to move, careful and deliberate, towards consequences that had long been delayed. For Katie's family, the moment was profound and complex. Relief intertwined with sorrow, clarity with lingering grief. The legal process could not return the years lost, could not replace the absence that had defined their lives, but it could hold accountable those responsible. It could transform uncertainty into consequence in the only way the system allows. The community watched quietly. Some felt vindication, others discomfort. Small towns, shaped by familiarity, rarely handle public acknowledgement of wrongdoing without friction. The arrest of someone known, even if only in passing, rippled through the neighborhoods where everyone once assumed safety. Accountability arrived like a shadow, necessary, inevitable, but heavy. Investigators remained measured in their statements. They spoke of the work done, of evidence reviewed, of the patience required to reach this point. There was no triumph, no dramatization, just the steady, factual reporting of actions taken, evidence corroborated, and legal steps now in motion. In the world of cold cases, justice is rarely immediate or emotionally satisfying. It is methodical, precise, and often incomplete, but it is real. Court proceedings followed. Legal teams presented evidence, witnesses gave testimony, and the facts, painstakingly laid out over time, began to determine the outcome. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency clarified. The weight of 5 years of silence hung over the courtroom, a quiet reminder of what delayed accountability costs. For the family, these proceedings were a mixture of relief and strain. Relief that the system was now engaging with the truth, that responsibility was being formally recognized. Strain because the process was slow, technical, and often removed from the emotional urgency of their loss. Justice, after so long, is both balm and burden. Across the town, the event prompted reflection. Silence, once protective, had delayed consequences. Community members who had once been hesitant to speak understood, in the shadow of legal action, the importance of courage and clarity. The case became not only a story of one missing girl, but a lesson in responsibility, moral and civic, in how the choices of individuals can alter the course of justice for years. Accountability, in this chapter of Katie Sepich's story, was not cinematic or immediate. It was measured, procedural, and deliberate. But it was essential. It acknowledged the harm done, validated the painstaking work of investigators, and most importantly, affirmed the dignity of the life that had been lost. Even as the court proceedings continued, the family and community faced the quiet truth that no legal outcome could fully erase the past. But for the first time in years, there was a sense that the story, long suspended between absence and uncertainty, was being grounded in fact, consequence, and recognition. The wheels of justice had turned, slowly but inexorably, towards accountability. 5 years. Years marked by unanswered questions, faint hope, and the quiet erosion of certainty. In the world of cold cases, time is rarely neutral. It changes evidence, it alters memories, it reshapes communities. But above all, it exacts a cost measured in lost moments, fractured trust, and the emotional toll of indefinite waiting. For Katie's family, the cost was intimate and profound. Every day without answers was a day suspended in grief. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones arrived with a hollow echo, a constant reminder of absence. Each unanswered phone call, each rumor circulating quietly in the community, compounded the pain. The absence of closure transformed ordinary life into a series of reminders that the truth was still just out of reach. Time also reshaped relationships. Friends and neighbors, unsure of what to say or do, slowly withdrew.
Conversations avoided the subject. Over time, even those who once actively searched began to move on. In a small town, silence is contagious. It shields some, isolates others, and delays resolution. For the family, it created a quiet isolation, a sense that their grief and their questions existed in a space apart from the rest of the world. For investigators, the cost was both professional and emotional. Each delay in answers meant lost opportunities, degraded evidence, and more complex lines of inquiry. Witnesses' memories faded, crucial details were misremembered, and the initial urgency that can sometimes make the difference in an investigation had dissipated. Years of work were required to reconstruct what might have been understood in months. The delay was not merely inconvenient, it was consequential. The community itself bore a subtle but real cost. Safety, once assumed, was called into question. Trust in neighbors, once unexamined, was shadowed by uncertainty. Rumors, speculation, and unverified stories flourished in the absence of clarity, creating tension and suspicion where none had existed before. The very fabric of a small town, defined by familiarity, shared history, and mutual dependence, became strained under the weight of unanswered questions. Time also altered perception. Early assumptions, runaway, accident, misadventure, hardened into local narratives, often at odds with the eventual facts. Each passing year made correcting these misperceptions more difficult, embedding them deeper into collective memory. When the truth finally emerged, it required not only reconstruction, but a calibration of understanding, a reminder that delayed justice can distort reality itself. And yet, within this cost lies a lesson. Silence, hesitation, and fear may delay justice, but they cannot prevent it indefinitely. The case eventually moved forward, accountability arrived, and the truth was reconstructed. But the years of waiting left a mark on those directly affected, on the investigators who persisted, and on the community that observed from a distance. It is a reminder that the consequences of delay are often hidden, subtle, and long-lasting, but no less real. The story of Katie Sepich illustrates that time, when unaccompanied by action, is not neutral. It is a force that magnifies absence, hardens uncertainty, and compounds grief. And for every moment the truth is withheld, there is a corresponding toll on relationships, on trust, and the emotional well-being of those left behind. The cost of waiting is a quiet one, measured not in headlines or dramatic revelations, but in the slow accumulation of lost days, missed opportunities, and fractured peace of mind. It is a cost that lingers long after arrests are made, facts are revealed, and accountability is achieved. For those who experienced the absence of answers firsthand, it is a reminder that justice delayed is more than a procedural failure. It is a human one.
If Katie's story has stayed with you, if her absence, the silence, and the fight for truth moved you, take a moment to honor her memory. Like this video to support the work of keeping cold cases in the light, and comment below to share your thoughts, your reflections, or the questions that linger for you. Every voice matters in ensuring stories like Katie's are never forgotten. Even after arrests are made, evidence examined, and the truth reconstructed, silence can linger. It does not disappear with legal proceedings. It does not vanish when accountability arrives. It persists, a subtle presence woven into the spaces where the unanswered once resided. For Katie Sepich's family, the silence is both absence and memory. It is the quiet that follows years of waiting, the pauses in conversation that once carried hope and uncertainty. It is the invisible weight that accompanies every reflection, every photograph, every place she once inhabited. The silence reminds them of what was lost and of what cannot be restored. In the community, the silence carries a different resonance. It is a reminder of choices made, or not made, whispers left unspoken, observations withheld, fears unchallenged. These echoes of inaction stretch far beyond one family. They ripple through relationships, institutions, and neighborhoods. Silence, in this sense, is never neutral. It shields, it protects, and sometimes it obscures the truth long enough to change the course of lives. Investigators, too, feel the imprint of silence. Years spent unraveling threads that could have been clear from the start leave a mark on professional and personal conscience. Cold cases are defined not just by missing evidence, but by missing words, missed opportunities, and delays born of hesitation or doubt. And while progress eventually arrives, the memory of what might have been done sooner lingers as a quiet admonition. The story of Katie Sepich is, in many ways, a story of silence. Not silence imposed by circumstance, but by choice, by the human tendency to avoid discomfort, to defer responsibility, or to hope that someone else will act. It is a silence that delays justice, prolongs grief, and obscures the clarity that can finally bring resolution. And yet the silence also teaches. It is a cautionary presence, a reminder that speaking up matters, that noticing matters, and that even small contributions can make the difference between truth emerging quickly or remaining obscured for years. The silence that remains is not merely absence, it is a lesson etched into memory for families, communities, and investigators alike. As the case closes, the silence will continue, but in a transformed way. No longer is it a barrier to understanding, now it is a reflection, a space for remembrance, and a quiet call to action for those who witness injustice or uncertainty in the future. It asks us to listen, to act, and to honor those who have been silenced, not by death, but by delay. Some cold cases are frozen not by lack of evidence, but by human choice. And in Katie Sepich's story, the lesson is clear. Truth eventually finds a way, but only if someone chooses to speak. The silence that remains is heavy, but it is also instructive. It asks us to confront our own hesitation, to recognize our own role in the spaces between knowledge and action, and to understand that waiting has consequences for the lost, for the living, and for the moral arc of justice itself.